In the early 2010s, Sony Ericsson released the Sony MH1 in-ear monitor. The Ericsson division was closed not long after, and the MH1 was quickly discontinued and sold off in bulk as OEM, where it found a whole new audience. The audiophiles who discovered the MH1 were blown away by its sound quality. Despite costing around $20 American, the Sony MH1 managed to sound better than even the most expensive offerings at the time. In essence, it kickstarted the budget IEM market years before the Chi-Fi revolution. The MH1 would later be succeeded by the Sony MH755 and MH750 from the same designer, though audiophiles debated if they were truly an upgrade due to their more pronounced V-shaped tuning. Last year, I filmed a review for the Sony MH1 in which I praised it for sounding nearly identical to the Sennheiser HD6XX in IEM form, but with a massive bass boost the 6XX could never produce without distortion. The review was less of a product recommendation and more of a lamentation. At the time, it seemed that the Sony MH1 was the IEM market's equivalent of the Library of Alexandria. Manufacturers and consumers alike had neglected its strong design principles in favor of snake oil hybrid drivers and faulty reference curves that sounded nothing like a pair of monitor loudspeakers in a good room. Still, it always felt disingenuous to publish a review of an IEM that 99.9% of people would not be able to purchase themselves. I knew that deep within the cesspool that is the modern IEM market, there had to be a worthy successor by now. One commenter clued me into the Moondrop variations, which indeed mimicked the MH1's treble response and graphs. Imagine my amusement, though, when I saw the price tag of the variations compared to the MH1. A bit later, someone on Discord recommended the Moondrop shoe, which was only $20 but measured fairly well. I had always wanted to try it out, but I never actually had the spare cash lying around due to the 2022 economy and gym commitments. When I finally got some bonus bucks from the Christmas season, customer reviews of the Moondrop shoe's poor QC steered me clear. This is where the subject of this review comes in, the 7Hz Salnotes Zero. I had the choice between these, the Tangzhou Oner, and the Triple N Leia, which I name-dropped in my previous headphone review. All three products got rave reviews online and were unanimously considered upgrades to the Chew in terms of tuning, features, and quality control. However, the Salnotes Zero caught my eye for a different reason, which I doubt any of the numerous show reviewers have pointed out. As it turns out, the Salnotes Zero measures almost identically to the Sony MH1 in the mid-range and treble. Could the 7Hz Salnotes Zero actually be the Sony MH1 successor we were waiting over a decade for? Well, they say that the human ear is what validates the graphs. Using my two ears, two sources playing Sonalski's tone generator normalized at 1000 Hz method, I'm pleased to report that the Salnotes Zero lives up to my high expectations. Super reviewers' measurements turned out to be almost completely accurate, with the exception of the 1500 Hz to 2000 Hz region, which was the opposite case for me. Also note that I've revised my testing methods for this video. In previous videos, I went by the volume slider on the web page itself, assuming it corresponded to the Windows volume slider. It turns out it doesn't, so these results actually were done with the Windows volume slider. While I said in my older Sony MH1 review that had some of the most natural sounding and speaker-like sound quality I've heard in an IEM, the 7Hz Salnotes Zero manages to up the ante by ironing out its few remaining flaws. The Salnotes Zero's base shelf is roughly the same as what sealing the MH1 with high viscosity polymer would have done. At the time, I liked the stock MH1 base shelf, but it did start manifesting itself as muddy recently. I listen to the Street Fighter EX arranged soundtracks a lot, probably way more than anybody should be, and Vegas theme from EX3 has an electric bass that's really susceptible to elevated bass tuning. In addition, the entire treble region from 5 kHz on has a plus 2 decibel tilt that makes the highs sound cleaner without making the overall tuning sound thin like on the Sony MH750. It's not just the sound quality that's improved over the Sony MH1 though. The 7Hz Salnotes Zero addresses some of the glaring design flaws of the MH1 as well. Most notably, it comes with a detachable 2-pin cable, thus entirely eliminating the need to cable mite it in the first place. This means that the Salnotes Zero is not only a quality listening device, but also potentially a gaming headset if you buy an aftermarket 2-pin boom mic cable on AliExpress. The stock cable itself is of questionable quality, being thin and prone to tangling. Still, I would take it any day over the MH1's god-awful microphonic J-cord fettuccine cable. The acrylic shell of the Salnotes Zero is far more ergonomic than the MH1's generic bullet design, and as far as I can tell it's a bit sturdier as well. In terms of power efficiency, the Salnotes Zero actually runs a little louder than the MH1 from the same source. This next point is rather hard to explain, as it's a bit of a use case situation, but there seems to be less crackling on the Salnotes Zero with low frequency sounds than the Sony MH1. I first heard this phenomenon with the Apple dongle on 2 short test tracks I recorded. Most of my gear actually suffered crackling from these samples except for the Sennheiser HD6XX. I'm not sure if this is inherent driver distortion or if it's the Apple dongle's 1 volt of amplification crapping on a low-ohms devices. If it's the latter, well, then that's a solid reason for objectivist audiophiles to stop recommending the Apple dongle, don't you think? Going back to the sound quality for a bit, the viewers who saw my MH1 review are probably wondering how the 7Hz Salnotes Zero stacks up to the Sennheiser HD6XX. The good news is that most of the frequency response actually compares well to the HD6XX. The entire mid-range from 200Hz to 2000Hz is spot on. I've seen a lot of reviewers complain the bass sounds weak on the Salnotes Zero, but it actually has the exact same mid-bass hump that the HD600 series has. It's likely more than what you'd hear on an actual monitor loudspeaker. The sub-bass shelf is interesting to point out. While the Salnotes Zero technically falls 2 decibels short of the Harman in-ear target, it actually overshoots the Harman over-ear target by 2 decibels, which makes it roughly equivalent to the AKG K371. Unfortunately, the bad news is that the 7Hz Salnotes Zero seems to have poor upper treble extension compared to the Sennheiser HD6XX. It wasn't an issue with the ear tips not sealing either. The treble just doesn't really seem to extend that much beyond 14 kHz. Comparing the Salnotes Zero to the JBL 305P Mark II speakers only confirmed this severe upper treble roll-off. What this translates to for less experienced listeners is that cymbals and other reverb cues are going to sound very muted, giving the subjective impression of low-resolution sound. I guess with a single dynamic driver IEM at this price point, you really can't complain. You're effectively trading the Sennheiser HD6XX's sub-bass deficiency for upper treble deficiency, but for $259 less, possibly even €498 less if you live in Europe and drop is not an option for you. You could just EQ that upper treble back on too if you really wanted it. I'm not sure of the distortion since most Chi-Fi is suspiciously lacking distortion measurements online, but it would probably fare much better than the HD6XX would with an equivalent sub-bass shelf. Dynamic driver IEMs in general tend to have much lower distortion than full-size headphones and speaker drivers. You know there's actually literal dollar store crap that measures lower total harmonic distortion than Abyss Labs' $6,000 headphones? Of course, a review of the 7Hz Salnotes Zero wouldn't be complete today without mentioning the Crinacle connection. Months after its release, Crinacle confirmed in a video that the Salnotes Zero was actually another in a long line of his numerous IEM collaborations. This came as a shock to me, as I've heard some of his recommendations in the past. Crinacle always seemed to have a taste for sibilant tuning, which made it rather frustrating when inexperienced listeners would parrot his opinions on what he considered neutral. What also makes this shocking is that Crinacle does not have measurements for the Sony MH1, leading me to believe he's never even heard the MH1 in his life. How is it then that the Salnotes Zero managed to sound so close to the MH1's tuning like nothing else has in the decades since its release? Could Crinacle have had the super expensive Moondrop variations in mind when tuning it? Or maybe, just maybe, the Sony MH1 is truly the peak of IEM engineering, and all acoustic research is bound to follow the same evolutionary path to its conclusion. In any case, I should probably share my thoughts on some of the more subjective aspects of the 7Hz Salnotes Zero. Some people seem to have grievances with the ear tips, but I don't think they're too bad. I honestly think 99% of people just try the default size ear tips and then complain when they don't seal properly. Some of the hole sizes are inconsistent, but that doesn't seem to affect the frequency response in any way. The ear tips come in an assortment of colors that correspond to the sizes, These colors don't seem to have been picked with any kind of aesthetic coherency in mind, though. The shells come in black, white, bootleg NES cartridge blue, and Crinacle's own dark red mecha variant with an upcharge. I would have liked some more interesting colors like jade green or dark purple, but I guess 7Hz was trying to distance themselves from other tri-fi brands in this price range. Speaking of which, I should also discuss the packaging for this product. Most of the notable tri-fi brands that get shilled in audiophile circles feature suspiciously young-looking anime girl drawings on their packaging. The 7Hz Salnotes Zero thankfully puts bros before hoes with this simplistic box design. No wasted space or cringeworthy slogans, just the very product you want with no distractions. Unfortunately, this does come at a price, as my default red ear tips came flattened, and so have most other people's from what I've read. While 7Hz might not publicly advertise on the box like Moondrop does, it seems that they too believe that flat is justice. Now in terms of quality control, I can't quite say what's wrong with this product yet, as I haven't owned it long enough to make any judgments. The Moondrop Shoe was rife with design flaws that show reviewers were quick to cover up, including some extremely bad channel imbalance. The drivers on my Salnotes Zero seem to be fairly matched, thankfully. The main problem that users are reporting is that the stainless steel plating on the shell falls off after a while, but this bit is purely cosmetic and can be salvaged with some glue. If you're worried about the mesh filters falling off, then there is a product on AliExpress that seems to be a perfect match. Regardless of any future QC issues, the Salnotes Zero is no doubt better than the Sony MH1, since the MH1 was quickly discontinued and sold off without any QC testing. This led many models to exhibit overly bassy tuning, among other deal-breaking flaws. In conclusion, the 7Hz Salnotes Zero is more than just the best deal on the audio market right now. It represents all the progress that's been made in IEM development thanks to the Chi-Fi boom. The best IEMs you could have bought 3 years ago at the start of the pandemic cost hundreds of dollars and still wouldn't have sounded anything like the Sennheiser HD600 series. The old Sony MH1 might have come closer to that bar, but it still had a ton of cost-cutting compromises. In 2023, you can buy an IEM for the price of an extra-large pepperoni pizza and get sound quality that's roughly on par with the professional control room without being nickeled and dimed on standard quality of life features. It's clear to me now that while speakers and headphones reached a technological plateau sometime in the early 90s, in-ear monitors still have plenty of innovation left to be discovered. I mean really, what notable full-size headphones came out in 2022? The Rode NTH100, which has severe bass and treble deficiency even compared to the veiled Sennheiser HD6XX, not to mention some blatant QC issues that clearly point to planned obsolescence. The most notable speakers that came out in the last decade seem to be the IK Multimedia iLoud micro monitors, and that's only really because of advancements in digital signal processing. In any case, I'm glad that the in-ear monitor market isn't actually one big scam like I had previously stated. It puts my mind at ease knowing that there are still quality affordable products out there if you're willing to put the effort into doing a little research. If any audiophiles out there tell you to avoid the Salnotes Zero for its dead clinical sound or non-existent soundstage, just ignore them. Take it from the guy who returned his Sennheiser HD800 after he EQ'd it to the Harman target and heard no differences when compared to an EQ'd COS KSC75.